Revisited. Nature Revisited is a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Norden. On this episode of Nature Revisited, we welcome Elspeth Hay, author of the new book, Feed Us with Trees, Nuts and the Future of Food. Elspeth Hay grew up in Maine, where she became well-versed in the ways other species adapted to wild ecosystems for their food, but where human communities were destroying those wild places at an alarming rate. In her quest to understand why, Elspeth spent 15 years interviewing food producers, harvesters, cooks, policymakers, and visionaries, and came to the conclusion that humans were also perfectly adapted to a wide range of places and foods. In addition to being a writer, Elspeth is the weekly host of the local Food Report, a public radio program that looks at the connections between people, places, and ideas that feed us. In Feed Us with Trees, Elspeth takes us on a journey with nut growers, scientists, indigenous people, and professionals to discover that we once played a vital role as one of the Earth's keystone species. Feed Us with Trees takes a critical look at long-held stories about our food and presents a brighter and more hopeful look at the future of food. Elspeth joins me from her home on Cape Cod. So Elspeth, welcome to Nature Revisited.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure having you on the podcast. Let's start at the beginning of your book, Feed Us with Trees, where you say that you decided to devote yourself to learning more about the best ways for farming, and you started with No Farms, No Food. Where did that lead you?
When I was a kid, I learned a story about the living world around us that basically said that we humans were separate from nature, that there wasn't a whole lot for us to eat in the natural world, that we had to destroy wild places in order to get our food. I found that story pretty devastating, but I put the pieces together, and that's kind of what things looked like. My parents were bird watchers, so we spent a lot of time going on bird watching trips. I noticed that all the other species were really perfectly adapted to the ecosystems where they lived, had food and a habitat and a way to build a home. And then we would go to the grocery store and get our food from these industrial farms that I knew were destroying wild places and the habitats where these other species lived. During high school, I spent a semester on an organic farm in Maine, learning about that type of food production, and that clearing forest land had disrupted the water cycle in a lot of places, was contributing to climate change. So I grew up sort of steeped in this way of understanding our relationship with the living world, where we were a disruption most of the time and sort of a nuisance.
You talk about how after watching a video by Marcy Mayer that a friend had sent to you, you say your world began to unravel. How so?
A friend sent me a link to a TEDx talk by Marcy Mayer, who is an American expat living in Greece. She said that acorns are edible, which I did not know. Not only that, but that they are a superfood and one of humanity's oldest foods. That sort of immediately put a crack in this story about the relationship between humans and the living world that I'd learned as a kid, because oak trees, I knew, are this incredibly important keystone species. So I thought, wait a second, if we can eat from this incredibly important plant that also supports so many other animals and insects and wildlife, then maybe we're not just inherently separate and bad after all. Maybe there's just something wrong with the stories I've learned.
So as a freelance reporter, you went to hear a talk by Mark Shepard at your local high school. Who is Mark Shepard, and what did you learn after listening to him and then visiting him at his new forest farm?
Mark Shepard is a farmer in Wisconsin. He is practicing something he calls restoration agriculture. And the basic idea is to restore degraded farmland with agriculture. Instead of restoring land through traditional ecosystem restoration, which a lot of nature-based groups are doing, he wanted to produce food and restore land. The way that he did that was to use a template by another Midwestern farmer named Philip Rudder, who had done some research on the native ecosystems of farmland in the Midwest, a lot of which used to be an ecosystem called oak savanna. So oak savanna is a grassy area dotted with trees and is home to a lot of native perennial food plants. What Mark did was take the list of species that are present in an oak savanna ecosystem, oaks and chestnuts and hazelnuts, wild carrots, wild lettuces, wild asparagus, all these different species, plums, wild apples like crab apples, raspberries, blueberries. He planted a farm with improved genetics from cultivated versions of those plants with 139 edible perennial species. It has an abundance of life on the land at this point. He started this in 1996, so a lot of the trees have really matured. Recently, he had an endangered species move back onto the property, the eastern Massawga rattlesnake. Walking that land is really a study in contrast after getting there by driving through miles and miles of really degraded corn and soy land, constantly sprayed with pesticides and herbicides, and really a monoculture in every sense of the word, void of all other life besides this crop. And then you walk onto Mark Shepard's farm, and the insect noise is just incredibly loud, and there are so many different food plants producing and animals taking advantage of that ecosystem. So it's pretty incredible to see.
So after your visit there, you traveled west to visit Ron Reed, a Karuk medicine man, cultural biologist, and indigenous activist. How did you meet Ron, and what were some of the stories he shared with you?
I met Ron after reading a book called Acorns and Salmon Feed Our People, which is by a non-native sociologist, Carrie Marie Norgard. And she introduced me to Ron via email. We spent a lot of time on Zoom before it was actually possible for us to meet. Ron told me about traditional Karuk food production, which was based on oak grassland ecosystems managed through cultural fire. Karuk people often call themselves Fix the World people and hold annual world renewal ceremonies. Ron shared with me a Karuk story which holds that before there were humans, there were spirit people. Spirit people gave the Karuk people this responsibility of burning regularly at world renewal ceremonies to renew the earth, to keep it in balance. That tradition was interrupted by the arrival of Euro-American settlers and incredible violence by those settlers against the Karuk people, and then a legacy of taking Karuk ancestral lands, turning them into national forest, and banning the cultural burns that for millennia had kept that landscape in balance. So when I met Ron, Part of the work that he was doing as an Indigenous activist was telling these stories to try to convince regulatory authorities to allow the Crook people to get fire back on the land. And a lot of really fascinating history of management with fire and of really creating abundance using this knowledge of the landscape.
Can you describe for us how you came to see humans as a keystone species?
I definitely have to credit Ron for that. He taught me just how powerful our stories are and how much the way we see our role in the landscape impacts the way we're actually acting on the landscape. So Ron had shared with me during a lot of our conversations his belief that fire is medicine for the land, fire is a form of prayer, and it's a way of producing food, keeping the land in balance for all the different species that rely on these oak grassland ecosystems in the Crook River Basin. The stories were incredibly beautiful and moving, but at first I didn't necessarily see how they connected to the landscape where I live. On Cape Cod, I had never heard of fire as a part of my home ecosystem. As I started learning and researching, I connected at first back to something Mark Shepard had said about the oak savanna ecosystem in the Midwest, that a lot of the species were really adapted to being burned, to being browsed, and to sprouting back. So I started looking at the history there and learned that that area also has a really long history of Indigenous fire management to create these oak ecosystems and prairie landscapes. When I started looking into some of the history on Cape Cod, where I live, it turns out that there's also a really long history of Indigenous burning here, and in fact, in most ecosystems all over North America. White oak in the Northeast has been the dominant tree on a lot of land for the past 9,000 years, despite some really dramatic changes in climate. And that's because of Indigenous burning. I live in the Cape Cod National Seashore, and a lot of the language that we often hear around the park describes the landscape as wild and pristine and natural. And wild and natural in particular are these words that by definition mean that they're not a result of human tending and human presence. As I started to learn more, I saw how those words can only really be applied if you erase all the Indigenous history on the land. These ecosystems are a result here and in many other places of Indigenous burning and Indigenous tending, none of which I knew before I started learning more about acorn history and oak history.
What are some of the misconceptions about farmers and hunter-gatherers, both in their practices and their history?
I always heard that there's this big event about 10,000 years ago, the Agricultural Revolution, where people all over the world on different continents and on different timelines transitioned from hunting and gathering, which was painted as this really different lifestyle, to farming. And that sort of allowed the population to grow and has really been one of humanity's biggest achievements. When I was talking to Ron Reed and hearing about some of these Crook acorn tending practices, I was learning about the different jobs that fire on the landscape does for some of these oak ecosystems. Ron was telling me about the ways that burning sort of acts as a fertilizer boost for the trees because it recycles nutrients really quickly back into the soil, about different ways that it helps control pests and pathogens like the acorn weevils that will infest acorns. Smoke can help keep those populations under control. Fire controls the water cycle, helps prepare the ground for acorns sprouting. And as he was going through these jobs, I was thinking, these are all the same jobs involved in farming. Plowing to prepare the land for your crop to sprout, you're watering, you're weeding, you're controlling pests and pathogens, you're applying fertilizer. And I started to wonder, why do we have different words for these two supposedly different methods of food production? When I started going back through the history, it turns out that the idea of hunting and gathering is actually a really modern idea. It wasn't in our language or in our concept as a culture until the 1930s. And it came into the conversation at the same time as this period of scientific racism, this really concentrated attempt to paint Indigenous people and some other cultures as people of the past and Euro-American farmers as people of the present. When you look at the jobs involved in these various forms of ecosystem tending, they're really the same jobs. We talk about the agricultural revolution as this huge event. It's all sort of a modern story, because when you look back at what was going on with plants and humans, there's not as much evidence for the story that we've been told as has been suggested.
Why does the question of yields dominate the world of agriculture?
We're really obsessed with yield when we talk about agriculture. And the reason for that really has much more to do with our government and our economic system than an actual need for food. We plant corn on an area the size of Texas in the United States. It is a huge area, and it's the cause of so many ecological problems, but we're always told that we have to grow food this way because this food system is feeding the world. If you start looking at agriculture numbers and how that corn is being used, that story starts to break down. About 45% of that is used to feed animals that would do better on pasture or other ecosystems. Another 40% is used to produce ethanol. About 15% is exported to other countries where it depresses local agricultural economies and wreaks havoc on their own food system. And less than 1% is eaten by human bodies in the United States. As we start to look at this idea that we have to produce more because there's just not enough to eat, it's really not true. That's being driven by economics and government subsidies, not by human hunger. Human hunger is a result of unequal access to food. It's not a result of the world not being able to produce enough food. I had really absorbed that story as a kid, and I believed it. And I thought we had to transition away from these hunting and gathering systems or these tree-based ecosystems because they didn't produce enough food. But a fully functioning tree-based ecosystem has way more photosynthetic capacity than a field of monocultural grain, and can also host a variety of different layers of species, and in fact produces much more food when we're looking at what we're putting in and what we're getting out. When we talk about yield and food production and what we need to do to feed the world, we tend to confuse what we think is an ecological conversation, how much can this land yield, with what's actually an economic conversation, which is how do we produce food efficiently in this economy that we've made up.
As part of your inquiry, you visited Rockcastle Gorge in Appalachia. What questions were you trying to answer, and what did you find?
Rockcastle Gorge is a really special spot in southwestern Virginia, and used to have this chestnut-based subsistence community, largely Euro-American, but very poor. Not a lot of landowners. The subsistence community around chestnuts was really based on what used to be common law in America: unenclosed land, unimproved land that wasn't fenced in, regardless of who it was owned by, was open to all as a gathering area, a hunting area, a place where you could turn out livestock to graze. And that economy was really present in Appalachia until the time of the Great Depression, which in that area coincided with the chestnut blight. I started asking questions about how my ancestors had become disconnected from some of these tree foods. When I looked back into older history, I could find all this history about Europeans and English people in particular revering oak trees as sacred, hazelnuts as sacred, eating from these trees. And then there was just sort of this gap, and then we got to the present where people don't know you can eat an acorn. And I was having a hard time figuring out, well, how did we get from there to here? Someone suggested, you should really go to Appalachia because they had this really thriving chestnut-based subsistence community in a lot of areas until the blight between the early 1900s and the 1940s. What I found was that in Appalachia until fairly recently, less than 100 years ago, there was a completely different set of cultural agreements in a lot of areas that allowed people to make a living off of land that they didn't own. through these subsistence practices. That started to change in some areas after the Civil War, because when formerly enslaved African American people were freed and had access to this land, it didn't line up with the Euro-American planters' agenda of forcing those people to continue working for them. But a lot of these mountainous, more remote communities had held on to that tradition until the death of chestnut trees and the changing economic conditions that spread in our country after the close of the war years. There was just so much history down there, and history that ended up connecting back to some older European traditions that explained how so many of us have become disconnected from these food sources today.
So how is basketry, ecological succession, and coppice connected?
I wasn't expecting to get into making baskets when I learned that we could eat acorns. A lot of nut species are tended with fire, and some are tended with coppice and pollard, which is sort of a cutting back of the tree. Coppicing is cutting it back to the ground. That's more common with hazelnuts and more shrub-like species. And then pollarding is cutting back to certain limbs, and then the tree sends out a flush of new growth. Fire and coppice and pollard are really ancient techniques that don't kill off these nut species, that help the plant stay young and vigorous and productive, similar to pruning a blueberry bush. As I started talking to people about these traditions of burning or cutting back the nut trees, I was exposed to a lot of basket making. It turns out that the twigs these nut species send out either right after being burned or right after being cut back are really useful for a lot of traditional basketry practices. A Karuk woman in California, Kathy McCovey, showed me these incredible hazelnut baskets made after a fire with the flush of new growth. And I came back inspired to learn how to make a basket, but couldn't find any hazelnut basketry courses on the East Coast. So I ended up taking a class with Willow, got totally hooked, and have started making baskets and really enjoying getting to know more about that tradition and connecting it really to the way that we manage the landscape. You were asking about succession. In kind of traditional European agriculture, we take succession, which is this process of a disturbed area moving all the way to a more mature ecosystem. And a lot of these nut species thrive in that middle range of succession. So not a disturbed field, not an old growth forest, but somewhere in the middle. What people are doing when they're managing with fire or coppice or pollard is holding succession in check and kind of keeping it in that middle stage to maximize nut production.
So what are some of the foods that one can make with nuts, such as hazelnuts, chestnuts, and acorns? And where can someone learn more about them?
So there are some really cool cookbooks coming out by cooks and chefs who have become focused on some of these nuts. One that I would really recommend, cookbook by Alan Burgo. He calls himself the Forager Chef, and he also has a great website with a lot of nut-based recipes. Nuts are really versatile. Acorns, I've heard called the tofu of the nut world. Acorn flour has a really mild taste. It acts really similar to corn flour in the sense that it doesn't have gluten. It's gluten-free. And most places where you can use corn flour, you can also use acorn flour. Hazelnuts and acorns can both be pressed for oil. It's this incredible orangey red color, really beautiful. Hazelnuts can also be made into flour. Chestnuts are known as the bread tree, because chestnuts are mostly starch. So unlike some other nuts which have more fat and protein, chestnuts are very starchy. Chestnuts often are paired with mushrooms, which I really like because they grow together. I have really been enjoying a lot of savory chestnut recipes, like a chestnut mushroom soup. You can saute chestnuts and mushrooms together. Chestnuts can be made into flour and made into just a huge array of things. Anywhere where you would use gluten-free flour, you can often use one of these nut flours.
So what are some of the health benefits from nut trees?
It really depends on the species that you're talking about. If you look at something like a walnut or a hazelnut, They are really rich in healthy fats and an incredibly dense source of energy. Acorns are super varied. Some oak species have acorns that are very high in oils and fats. Some have acorns that are more starchy. And then chestnuts are mostly starch. Just like with grains, a lot of how much nutrition you get from a nut depends on how you process it. Acorns require a special type of processing, similar to olive processing, where they have to be debittered. So acorns have tannins, which are an anti-nutrient and taste incredibly bitter to humans. If you've ever eaten an olive straight off a tree, you'll spit it right out. Your mouth will pucker up. They do not taste good. And the same is true of acorns. They have that same bitter tannin. Before you can use acorns for flour, you have to debitter them by grinding them up and then soaking them in repeated changes of water. And that's really important to note because we need to understand, in order to get proper nutrition from acorns, how to process them. I want to throw that out there just because I think a lot of folks don't know that, and it is really important to the whole process.
How do you see the future of nut trees in our food crisis?
I've gotten some emails from people who think that I'm anti-grain. I'm not. I think that there's a really important place for annual crops, grains, and vegetables in our food system. When I look at the future of our food system, what we're missing right now is a balance between these annual crops and more perennial crops. When we think about our relationship with the living world and what we're planting and what we're relying on and what we're tending, if we could transition half the land that we have currently planted in some of these annual grain crops into tree crops instead, and into a diversified ecosystem that's producing a number of different foods, we will see a huge response from the land and from other species around us. Anytime that you're putting a keystone species back on the land, you're creating habitat and increasing the amount of life in that ecosystem. When I think about the future of food, I think about these trees and about that shift. I also think that there are some really deep and difficult cultural and economic questions that we're going to have to grapple with along the way in order to see real change.
So lastly, what do you hope people will take away with them after reading your book?
I hope that people will take some hope away from the book. Early on in the book process, I talked to a farmer named John Kempf, who's doing some really interesting work with regenerative agriculture. And he said something that's just stuck with me, which is that it's much more powerful to be for something than against something. I think that in environmental circles, often we hear a lot about what to be against, not a lot about what we can be for and how to play a positive role on the landscape. Learning about our relationship with oak trees really opened up this whole new way of seeing our relationship with the natural world or the living world, and of interacting with other species on our landscapes. Regardless of where people live, whether there are oak trees there or not, people will take away this idea that if we can get into relationship with the other keystone plants in our ecosystem, we can really change our impact on that place. From thinking about how do we shrink our footprint to how do we increase our positive footprint and create more life in this ecosystem.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with Elspeth Hay, and that you take the opportunity to read her new book, Feed Us with Trees, Nuts and the Future of Food, as well as visit her website, elspethhay.com, to learn more about the wonderful world of nut trees and place-based foods. If you enjoyed this episode of Nature Revisited, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and on our website, nordenproductions.com. And please share your comments and suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for this episode is The Machine in the Garden by Ben Cosgrove from his album, The Trouble with Wilderness. The Nature Revisited team consists of Stefan Van Orden, Charles Gagan, and Scott Chasky. And I hope you will join us for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.